The first thing he noticed was the sound of the lights dying. The fluorescent tube above the evidence room door buzzed once, twice, then surrendered, leaving the hallway in a shallow, grainy dusk. In that half-light, the world seemed to pause, breath held, throat tight. Shadows pooled in the corners like old secrets gathering courage. The linoleum floor, once white, now carried the color of nicotine and forgotten winters, scuffed by boots that had come and gone, men and women who'd stood here before him, thinking they were getting closer to answers. Detective Rowan Hale stood alone in the corridor, the hum of the aging police station around him thinning to a kind of static silence. This wing, the oldest part of the building, felt more like an abandoned memory than a functioning office. Cracked ceiling tiles sagging like tired eyelids, the faint smell of mildew and coffee that had turned bitter hours ago, the reluctant wheeze of the heating system rattling inside the walls. It was late enough that the rest of the department had either gone home or retreated to brighter rooms. Here, the quiet had weight. It settled on his shoulders, pressed against his chest, seeped under his skin. Every sound he made, a step, a breath, the idle flex of his fingers, came back to him slightly delayed, as if time were looping slower in this corridor, replaying everything with the hesitation of regret. Rowan stared at the door, marked with a fatting label. ARCHVS Cold Cases. The edges of the label had curled, brittle with age. Someone had once tried to tear it off, leaving a jagged strip where the word cold was almost ripped away. A good effort, he thought, but the past had a way of resisting removal. On the wall opposite, a bulletin board sagged under the weight of outdated notices and forgotten memos. Halloween potlucks from 10 years ago, portraits of officers who had retired or died, yellowing flyers asking about missing dogs whose owners had long since stopped calling. The thumbtacks were rusted. One paper had slipped free at the corner and hung crooked, the word missing still legible in bold black letters, even as the photo beneath was blurred by time. That word had its own gravity. It pulled him forward. The floor creaked under his boots as he took the final steps to the door. His hand hovered over the metal handle, fingers tracing the cold, dull shine of it. He'd been here before, decades ago, though not as a detective, not with a badge, not with the authority of the state behind him. Back then he'd been shorter, quieter, his eyes still soft at the edges. Back then he had stood behind his mother, fingers tangled in the hem of her coat, listening to the adult's whisper. Idaho, 1977. The phrase lived in his mind like a title of a film he'd seen too young. He could still recall fragments. Snow drifting down over a small town like someone shaking ashes from a great invisible hand. The echo of church bells on a Sunday afternoon. The way everyone looked over their shoulder that year, as if the air itself might be watching. The year a girl vanished. He'd been 8, old enough to feel the disturbance, too young to understand its shape. The town had changed overnight, doors locked earlier. Parents counted heads at dusk. The woods at the edge of town, once a kingdom for children, became a dark, unspoken boundary. The girl's name had become a hush in his house, a caution in his mother's voice, a flicker in his father's gaze when the news came on. The name had never left him. Mara Ellison, 19 years old, lived in a white farmhouse off County Road 6, played piano at the local church on Sundays, worked weekends at the diner with the flickering neon sign, the girl with the dark braid and the quiet smile. Everyone remembered her as if she'd been a promise the town had made to itself. A good girl, a kind girl, a future they could be proud of. And then, one October evening, she had walked out of the diner into the sharp, cold air and simply never arrived home. No body, no witnesses, no conclusion. Just absent, stretching through decades. Rowan exhaled slowly. The breath trembled more than he wanted to admit. Officially, this was just another cold case reopened after a new lead. Unofficially, it was a return, a pilgrimage to the wound that had shaped his entire understanding of fear, of justice, of what could be lost in the quietest hours. He turned the handle and opened the door. The archive room was a rectangular hollow of dust and metal. Rows of filing cabinets stood like rusted tombstones, their drawers labeled in an old, precise hand. A single desk lamp on a back table cut a weak circle of light through the gloom, illuminating floating motes of dust that moved slowly, like exhausted snow. The air was colder here, the temperature dipping just enough to make his breath faintly visible. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, letting the sound of it closing echo in the room, a dull, final thud, like the lid of a coffin. Silence settled again, denser this time. He crossed to the far wall where a row of boxes sat on a low shelf, each marked by a year. The cardboard had softened with age, the ink faded. 1974, 1975, 1976. His hand paused above them before settling on the number that had haunted him for years. 1977. He slid the box off the shelf, the cardboard rasping against wood, and carried it to the center table. For a moment he just stood there, fingers splayed on the lid, feeling the weight of it, papers, photographs, objects that once belonged to someone whose life had been reduced to evidence. The room seemed to lean inward, cabinets and walls and shadows drawing closer. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, a steady, insistent drum. He lifted the lid. Inside, the past waited. On top, a plastic evidence bag lay like a flattened, preserved insect. Beneath that, photocopied reports, letters, a few Polaroids with the color washed out to soft sepia. And there, just beneath the first stack of paperwork, something small glinted in the lamplight, a fragile, familiar shape he hadn't expected to see again outside of memory. For a second, Rowan thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But when he reached in and lifted it free, the cold metal against his skin made the moment undeniably real. It was a pendant. An enamel pendant in the shape of a winter rose, the white petals outlined in thin veins of silver, the center a small, faded red stone. The chain had broken near the clasp, leaving it short, like something snapped mid-breath. He had seen this before, not in photographs, not in reports. He'd seen it once on the neck of a girl with a dark braid and a quiet smile as she'd leaned over the church piano, fingers mapping out the notes to a hymn. She had laughed when his mother complimented it. A gift, she'd said, and for years he'd wondered from whom. Now, decades later, the winter rose lay in his palm, a tiny, undeniable anchor to the night she disappeared. A long, low shiver moved through him. The room felt smaller, the silence heavier. This was supposed to be just another box, just another case. But as his fingers tightened around the pendant, Rowan understood with a sinking clarity. He was not just reopening an investigation. He was stepping back into his own unfinished memory. 2. Old disappearance resurfaces after discovery of symbolic object. The report, when he finally forced his eyes away from the winter rose pendant, was clinical in a way that felt almost obscene. Typed lines, dates, names, circumstances, the language of procedure laid over the raw nerve of a life halted mid-sentence. Victim Mara Ellison. Age 19. Last seen, October 14, 1977, 9:17 p.m., leaving the Silver Spur Diner. Beneath that, statements taken from coworkers, family, the lone customer who remembered her topping off his coffee before she stepped outside into the cold. Words like routine, no unusual behavior, and normal demeanor repeated themselves like a denial. No one ever writes, We didn't know how much the night was about to change us. Rowan flipped through the thin stack of papers, pages whispering as they turned. The original detective's notes were in blue ink, their cursive slanting sharply toward the margin, as if the writer had been leaning into the task with stubborn intent. There were sketches of the diner's layout, a rough map of the country roads between town and the Ellison farm, names of boys who'd been infatuated with Mara, a neighbor who claimed to have seen a truck, a pastor who said she'd seemed thoughtful that Sunday, as if she was carrying something. Carrying what? The silence following that detail annoyed him. People loved to remember omen-like fragments after the fact, as if tragedy were retroactively foreshadowed. It made everything feel cinematic, tied up in tidy arcs. But the real thing was never tidy. It was jagged. It cut in directions no one had anticipated. His gaze drifted back to the pendant resting on the table, still in his open palm. In the dim light of the archive room, its white enamel looked almost gray. The tiny red stone in the center had clouded with age, yet it remained unmistakable. He remembered the first time he'd noticed it. The church had been cold that morning, his nose pink from the October air that had knifed through his jacket on the walk there. He'd been bored and fidgety, watching dust float through the shafts of light bleeding in through the stained glass. And then Mara had begun to play. The piano's sound had filled the church, not loudly, but completely, like seeped warmth. She'd worn a cream-colored dress and that pendant, the winter rose resting in the soft hollow of her throat. It had caught the light whenever she leaned forward, flaring briefly like a small, trapped star. His mother had squeezed his hand and whispered, "Listen, she makes the hymns sound new, doesn't she?" After she vanished, every detail became a relic. The pendant had been one of them, a thing he thought he'd never see again outside of the blurred landscape of memory. Yet here it was, sealed, tagged as evidence, assigned a number. He picked up the plastic bag it had been resting on, reading the label. Item 4. Pendant found in SNOWBNK NEARELLISON property, JAN 1978. So they had found it months after, buried in snow, unearthed by thaw, a detail his family must have mentioned once, a long time ago in voices dulled by resignation. Back then he'd been a child. The implications, the timelines had blurred. Adults talked across him, not to him. He could see it now, the farmhouse, the long road, the ditches choked with slush and ice when winter began to loosen its grip, a deputy stooping to pick something glinting in the gray melt, a careful hand dropping it into a bag. He turned the bag over. The handwriting was the same as in the original notes. Detective Hargrove, the man who had gone gray in this building chasing leads that never turned solid. The man Rowan had watched from a distance growing up, an almost mythical figure carrying the town's unanswered questions like stones in his pockets. He could feel Hargrove's exhaustion lingering here, like stale smoke clinging to the walls. The case had officially resurfaced the previous week, when a retired officer, going through his attic in preparation for a move, had found an old box of overflow evidence mistakenly taken home during a renovation of the station in the late 80s. In that box, duplicate photos, backup tapes, and a list of items that had been logged, transferred, and supposedly returned. On that list, highlighted in yellow, Item 4, Pendant Location Unknown. For decades, it had been marked as misplaced. And yet the pendant sat here now, very much present. Rowan's jaw tightened. Something in his chest flickered, a cold, crackling anger that had nothing to do with the object itself and everything to do with what it represented. A symbol of how easily things were lost, how quickly entire lives could slip into the gaps between forms, boxes, moves. How a girl could vanish and even her belongings could become unmoored, drifting between shelves, attics, forgotten corners. He slipped the pendant back into the evidence bag and sealed it with a decisive press of his fingers, as if he were trying to secure more than just an object. The phone on the far wall, an old beige relic with a curling cord, gave a single, abrupt ring, too sharp in the muffled air. The sound made his shoulders jump. For a moment he considered ignoring it. No one called this room, but it persisted. Another ring, then another, in slow, impatient pulses. He crossed the space and lifted the receiver. Hale. Static, a faint hum of the station beyond, then a voice. You still down in the tomb? It was Sergeant Lane, his tone carrying that easy, frayed humor people used when trying not to sound concerned. Yeah, Rowan said. His voice sounded unfamiliar to his own ears, thicker, lower. Just getting started, what's up? They want you in the briefing room at 9 tomorrow, Lane replied. DA sending someone over. They're talking about possible arrests depending on what you dig up down there. Lot of noise, lot of interest. You know how it gets. Rowan's eyes shifted back to the pendant, small and sharp against the dim. Since when do they talk arrests on a case that's been cold this long? He asked. A soft exhale on the other end. Since the town never forgot her. Since new DNA tech and old rumors woke up at the same time. You're the one who pushed to reopen it, Hale. They're listening. Don't go quiet on me now. He said nothing. The silence stretched, dense and suggestive. Lane filled it. Look, I know this one's close to home. Just remember, procedure first. Don't let the ghosts drive the car. The corners of Rowan's mouth twitched, humorless. They're just riding shotgun. Yeah, well, keep 'em buckled in. See you in the morning. The line clicked dead. He stayed there for a moment with the receiver still in his hand, listening to the empty tone, the faint buzz that sounded almost like distant whispering if he let his mind go soft around the edges. Possible arrests, Lane had said. The phrase felt wrong in his mouth when he repeated it silently, because underneath the official excitement, he knew what reopening this case had really done. It hadn't just stirred up new forensic possibilities. It had disrupted an informal agreement the town had made with itself, that the past was, if not forgiven, then at least buried under enough layers of years to be bearable. Reopening meant re-examining stories people had settled on to sleep at night. It meant asking old men new questions, walking into houses that had once been young families' homes and finding them half empty, photographs faded on the walls. It meant reminding everyone that Mara had once been real. And for him, personally, it meant peeling back the scab on the oldest unease he knew. The quiet fear that nothing was ever truly resolved, that the world could swallow someone whole and the rest of them would simply move around the empty space. He hung up the phone and returned to the table. The pendant lay in its bag, the winter rose warped slightly by the plastic. He imagined the moment it had fallen, if it had fallen, a hand struggling, a chain snapping, or maybe a swift, thoughtless movement, someone tugging it off and discarding it into the snow. Whose fingers had made that choice? Hers? Someone else? Those weren't just questions of fact. They were questions of intent, of intimacy. He opened a fresh notebook, and beneath the bold block letters already written on the top of the page, ELLISON, MARA, 1977, he added a single line. The rose returns. The words looked strange, almost theatrical, but they fit. This was no ordinary object. It was a symbol, an intrusion of past into present, a reminder that what had slipped through the cracks still wanted to be found. What he didn't write, but felt pressing just as strongly, was this. So do I. Because somewhere under the layers of duty, evidence, and professional curiosity, another motive burned, quieter and far more dangerous. He needed this case to make sense not only for Mara, or for the town, or for the department. He needed it to make sense of himself. And a single, fragile pendant had just told him that the story he'd lived with all his life was not finished yet. 3. Investigator shows personal involvement, mixing duty with obsession. He didn't go home that night. Officially, Rowan logged the overtime as a necessary extension of case review. Unofficially, he simply couldn't bring himself to leave the building, to step back into the soft domestic quiet of his apartment, where the walls held no memory of 1977, where the fridge hummed benignly, and the clock above the sink ticked with ordinary indifference. The station, for all its flaws, its peeling paint, its flickering lights, felt more honest. Its tiredness matched his own. Its shadows, at least, contained purpose. He made coffee in the break room, the machine growling and spitting like it resented being woken up again. The liquid came out too dark, too bitter, but he drank it anyway, the heat scraping his throat as if it were an offering he had to accept. On the corkboard near the coffee maker, someone had pinned a printout of an online article. The headline, Idaho 1977 Cold Case Solved, Arrests Shocks Community, was circled in red pen, the tense slippage between solved and shocks underlined twice. Rowan stared at it. The article had gone up the moment the DA's office leaked that they were revisiting the old files and anticipated new developments. The press didn't bother with nuance. They loved phrases like finally solved, shatters years of silence, long-awaited justice. To anyone reading it, the narrative was simple: old case, new evidence, arrest imminent, closure. But closure, he knew, was a word journalists used like punctuation, a neat ending to a messy story. He tore the printout from the board and folded it once, twice, until the headline disappeared into sharp creases. Then he tossed it into the trash. The gesture was small, almost petty, but it brought a fleeting relief, like popping a joint back into place. Duty said, follow the evidence, build the case, present the truth. Obsession murmured, make it mean something. Back in the archive room, he spread the old photographs across the table, arranging them in loose constellations. The lamplight skimmed their glossy surfaces, painting the decades-old images in a thin sheen of gold. Mara at the diner, captured in a grainy Polaroid taken by some bored coworker playing with a new camera. The silver and red jukebox behind her, a row of red vinyl stools lined up like orderly wounds. Her smile was small but genuine, the kind that started in the eyes before it reached the mouth. The pendant rested against her collarbone, a tiny bright point even in the faded image. He put that photo in the center. Around it he placed the others: the farmhouse, the snow-drifted road, the tree line at the edge of the Ellison property where tire tracks had once been faintly visible. Faces of people who'd given statements, parents, friends, a youth pastor whose gaze seemed to slide just off camera, as if unwilling to be fully captured. He stood over the table, fingers hovering above the photos but not quite touching, as if he feared smudging more than the ink. In his mind, scenes layered over scenes. The real places as they must have looked back then. The way they looked now when he'd driven past them in recent years, pretending it was just habit, not pilgrimage. His own memories as a child, peeking out from the back seat at the farmhouse as his father drove by slower than usual, his mother turning the radio down whenever the news mentioned Mara's name. He saw himself seated on the hard wooden pew of the church, swinging his legs just enough to feel the edge of his mother's disapproval, watching Mara's hands move over the keys. He remembered asking his mother, in a whisper, months after the disappearance, "Do you think she's cold?" His mother's face had gone pale in that particular way adults' faces went pale when confronted with a child's bluntness. She'd smoothed his hair, corrected his posture, told him to pray for her soul. No one had answered the question. Now, decades later, he still felt the chill of it. He sat down, the metal chair scraping softly against the floor, and opened the original interview transcript with Mara's parents. Ink bled through flimsy paper, the edges browned. He read their words. "She never stayed out late," Mrs. Ellison had said. "She always called." "She wasn't seeing anyone that we knew of," Mr. Ellison had added. "If she was, she kept it to herself." Between the lines, Rowan could feel the tension, parents straining to protect their daughter's memory, even in the face of questions that insisted there must have been a secret, a flaw, something that made what happened comprehensible. He imagined them now, older, diminished, if they were even still alive. He should have checked, he realized. Not as a detective, but as the boy who had once watched their faces from a distance at church functions, seeing grief like a tightness around their mouths, a stiffness in their shoulders. Why hadn't he gone to them when he was old enough, badge on his chest, and said, "I remember her too"? Because that would have crossed a line. The line between professional detachment and personal investment. He'd been told at the academy that detectives needed distance. Empathy, yes, but not entanglement. You get too close, they said, and the case starts to own you. Your judgment blurs. You see what you want instead of what's there. He thought about that now, as he traced the edge of Mara's photo with his gaze. Was he already too close, or had he always been? He pulled his notebook closer and began to write. Not bullet points, not organized questions, but fragments. She played piano/winter, rose/road between diner and farm/rumor about the pickup truck/father's silence/Hargrove's frustration/snow, hiding what ground remembers. The words spilled out in half-phrases, a kind of map of his inner landscape rather than the case itself. This was not how he was supposed to work. He knew the proper approach: timeline, alibis, physical evidence, chain of custody, and he would get there. But part of him believed, irrationally, stubbornly, that the emotional pattern mattered too. The way guilt threaded through a town, the way secrets pressed into the grain of wood in a diner's counter, the way a girl's absence left echoes behind. Obsession doesn't announce itself all at once. It seeps in. In the way he checked the time and realized hours had passed without him noticing. In the way he kept replaying the Pendant's journey, from her neck, to the snow, to Hargrove's evidence list, to the attic, to this table, as if tracing it would somehow reveal the intent behind it. In the way he heard Lane's earlier warning, "Don't let the ghosts drive the car," and thought, almost defensively, what if the ghosts know the way? He rubbed his eyes and stood, needing movement. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the walls pressing inward under the weight of files, of years, of things unsaid. On the far cabinet, a drawer labeled ELLISON, MARA Media stuck out half an inch. He tugged it open. Inside, old cassette tapes, each marked with dates and names, local news broadcasts, radio segments, interviews. He picked one at random and set it in the dusty tape player on the shelf. The machine clicked, word, and then a wavering voice cut through the static. A news anchor, the grain of the recording making her sound distant, ghostly. Still no sign of 19-year-old Mara Ellison, missing now for 10 days. Authorities urge anyone with information to come forward. The community continues to pray for her safe return. The sheriff's office. He stopped the tape. The air thickened with what didn't happen, with the phone calls never made, with evidence never found. He realized his hands were clenched. He forced them to relax, fingers stretching slowly, feeling the ache in the joints. Duty asked, "What is the next logical step?" Obsession asked, "Why does this feel like fate?" He turned back to the table and picked up the pendant, still in its bag, crinkling softly. He held it up against the lamp. The winter rose glowed faintly, catching the light in its chipped enamel. He thought of all the times he'd chosen this path without admitting to himself that he was choosing it. Criminology classes focused on missing persons. Internship with the unit that handled long-term unsolved cases. Volunteering for every cold case review that passed his desk. As if some part of him had always been trying to loop back to 1977. To the town that had taught him fear. To the name that still made something in his chest constrict. Mara Ellison wasn't just another victim file. She was the origin story of his career, of his unease, of the way he looked at the world and saw how easily people could vanish. It made him effective. It made him relentless. It also made him vulnerable. He set the pendant down carefully and stepped back, as if distance alone could restore some semblance of objectivity. The shadows of the room shifted with his movement, stretching and retracting like the slow pulse of something alive. "Okay," he murmured into the silence, the word barely more than a thread of sound. "We do this right for her, for everyone." The unfinished sentence hung there, accusing. For her, for the town, for the department. For the boy he'd been, sitting on a pew, asking if she was cold. Duty and obsession reached for the same case file, fingers overlapping, neither willing to let go first. Rowan didn't expect company in the archive room. The hour was too late, the air too still. Yet the soft creak of the door caught him mid-thought, mid-breath, as if the room itself inhaled in warning. A silhouette paused in the doorway, haloed faintly by the weaker hallway light. Still awake in the mausoleum, the voice was low, steady, familiar. Rowan turned. Grace Calder stood there, arms crossed, her dark coat still buttoned against the winter wind outside. She was one of the few detectives who had stayed long enough to understand the architecture of his silences. 10 years his senior, she carried a kind of measured gravity that made people trust her, often unwisely. Her eyes, small and sharp behind wire-frame glasses, swept over the scattered photographs. "Lane told me you'd hole up down here," she said. "Didn't realize he meant literally." She stepped inside. Rowan felt the room tighten, become more fragile with her presence, as if a secret might crack open if either of them moved too quickly. Grace didn't approach the table right away. Instead, she went to the old radiator beside the far cabinets, placing a hand on the metal ribs. "Still cold as ever," she murmured. "This wing hasn't changed in 40 years." Rowan said nothing. She didn't ask permission to join him. She simply crossed to a metal chair, pulled it closer, and sat down. The shadows rearranged around her, the lamplight brushing the fine lines around her mouth. "What did you find?" she asked. He hesitated, then slid the evidence bag toward her. The pendant shifted inside like something restless. Grace's expression changed, not shock, not recognition, but something quieter, a kind of reverence. "The winter rose," she whispered. "You knew it." "Knew of it." She lifted the bag, holding it delicately by the edges. "Everyone did. Small town. A piece of jewelry becomes a thing people talk about. I remember hearing it belonged to her grandmother." Rowan tried to remember if he'd ever heard that. His childhood memories were foggy at the edges, blurred by the evasive habits of adults. Grace studied him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I feel like I have, he admitted. She didn't smile or soften. Instead, she placed the bag down carefully. This case, Hargrove used to say it had gravity, pulled good cops into it until they were all orbit and no direction. Don't let it get to you like it got to him. It's already in me, Rowan said, surprising himself with the bluntness. Grace's gaze sharpened, because of her. He nodded once. Grace leaned back in her chair. I remember the day she went missing. I was 14. My mom wouldn't let me walk the road to school after that, said a girl could disappear between two breaths. Her voice hollowed slightly at the memory. In towns like ours, fear spreads faster than truth. And truth gets buried, Rowan said quietly. Grace's eyes drifted to the photos. Sometimes forgotten, sometimes ignored, sometimes protected. Rowan tensed. Protected from what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up one of the Polaroids, Mara laughing behind the diner counter, and traced the blurred outline of her face. You ever notice, she said, that the people who remember her most vividly are never the ones interviewed? It's always second-hand stories, safe retellings. But the ones truly affected, the ones who felt her absence, they never talked about it. Who do you mean? Grace looked at him with a mixture of pity and warning. Kids, Rowan. Kids who sat in church or school with her. Kids who didn't understand grief yet. Kids who carried it in ways the adults never realized. He swallowed hard. Was she pointing at him, or at something broader? The implication hung between them like dust in the stale air. She was part of us, Grace continued. Part of the landscape. Some losses change the shape of a place. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed the photo down. He noticed. She knew something, felt something she wasn't saying. But in true Grace fashion, she wouldn't push. She would wait for him to speak first. Instead, he asked, "Why come down here tonight?" Grace exhaled. "I figured you'd need someone to remind you you're not alone inside this thing." He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. Loneliness had become a kind of quiet companion he hadn't realized he'd been feeding. Grace stood. "I'm heading home. Try not to drown in the archive before sunrise." She paused in the doorway, her outline thin and weary. "Rowan." He looked up. "People think solving old cases frees you. Sometimes it just reopens the hole." Then she slipped out, leaving her warmth behind like an indentation in the air. Rowan stared at the closed door. Grace's presence had cracked something inside him, not broken but fissured. Through the fissure, an older ache surfaced. He remembered faces from childhood, classmates who whispered, mothers who clutched their daughters tighter. He remembered a boy who sat beside him in church, repeating over and over that the woods were angry. 3 emotionally tethered figures rose in his mind. Grace carrying a quiet sorrow she never unpacked. Hargrove, the ghost cop whose handwriting still haunted these files. Rowan himself, the child who had grown into the man now staring at a winter rose as if it held the map to his own past. Each of them shaped the case in ways the official reports never captured. These weren't suspects. They were mirrors. The weight of their shared history pressed in, turning the room dimmer, heavier, more intimate. The emotional orbit tightened around him. The mystery was no longer just Mara's. It was theirs. And his. And something was pulling them all back toward the same quiet, cold center. 5. Symbolic clues, photos, diary, patterns build intellectual intrigue. Rowan returned to the table after Grace left, the silence settling again, deeper this time, less empty. A kind of humming tension lingered, as if the air remembered her words and repeated them to itself. He laid the pendant in the center of the photograph constellation again, like a star anchoring a small, troubled galaxy. Then he noticed something. On the back of the Polaroid of Mara at the diner, one he had previously flipped over without much thought, there was faint writing in pencil, barely visible unless tilted under the lamp. He angled it. 4 small letters appeared. WRME. His heart kicked once hard. Initials. 2 sets. One was obviously Mara Ellison. The other, WR. He forced his mind not to jump, not to let obsession outrun logic. Still his pulse climbed. W could be William, Walter, Warren, Wesley. R could be Reed, Rourke, Reynolds. But there was one possibility he couldn't ignore. Rowan Hale. He shoved the thought away. Too easy, too self-centered, too dangerous. He scanned his memory, trying to recall boys or men from 1977 with those initials. Kids at church. Teenagers who worked odd jobs around town. Teachers, pastors, drifters, cousins of cousins. But the writing looked young. Tentative. Almost shy. A message between teenagers. He placed the photo aside carefully and opened the next envelope, one containing a series of items cataloged but never deeply analyzed. Inside were a school notebook belonging to Mara, its cover frayed, a torn journal page with a single unfinished sentence, a flyer for the church's autumn festival, a small pattern drawn in the corner of one of her class notes. He opened the notebook first. The writing inside was neat, looping. Math exercises, vocabulary lists, scribbled reminders about shifts at the diner and hymn practice. All ordinary. But 3 pages in, she had drawn something at the bottom corner. A small rose, petals curling inward, the same pattern repeated across several pages. He ran his thumb lightly over one. It wasn't just a doodle. It looked deliberate, practiced, like a symbol she needed to remember or keep close. Beside one rose, she'd written a single line. Don't forget what he said. No name. No context. Just that. Rowan felt the back of his neck warm as if someone were breathing close behind him. He didn't turn around, didn't want to confirm the emptiness. He opened the torn journal page next. The handwriting was more rushed, emotional, the pencil darker. The page ended abruptly, torn through the middle of a sentence. I know the woods are not safe anymore, but nothing else. The tear was jagged, violent. Was it torn the night she died? Or earlier, in private frustration? And who had told her the woods weren't safe? A pattern emerged, not of facts but of feeling. Fear. Secret relationships. Private symbols. A certainty that something was watching the edges of her life. He arranged the objects before him in a line. Pendant. Polaroid. Notebook drawings. Torn journal fragment. Pattern repeated like a quiet mantra. Together they told a story not of sacrifice or random violence, but of entanglement, emotional entanglement. Someone she trusted, feared, or both. This wasn't just evidence. These were echoes. He spread them wider, imagining them as fragments of a greater tapestry. Like constellations, patterns emerged only when seen from the right distance. Not too close, not too far. Her story wasn't linear. It pulsed, like memory, like guilt, like breath. He felt himself leaning forward, drawn to the gaps between the clues, the unspoken spaces where truth hid like a wounded animal. Patterns formed in his mind. Roses in her notebook. Rose pendant snapped at the chain. Rose-like stains on one of the Polaroid's edges. Woods not safe. Someone whose initials began with W. A connection no one had documented. When he lifted the pendant again, it felt heavier. And then, a soft, nearly imperceptible sound. A whisper, or paper shifting. He froze. Nothing moved. But the room felt fuller, charged. These clues weren't pointing outward. They were turning toward him. Toward his own memories, his own childhood impressions, the edges of dreams that had felt like nightmares. The symbols were Mara's alone. Somewhere, somehow, they were tied to him. He stared at the evidence, heart thudding, breath shallow. The case wasn't building toward a suspect. It was building toward a realization. One he wasn't ready to articulate. Not yet. 6. Twist questions investigators' perception, blurring truth and delusion. The deeper Rowan sank into the documents, the more the air in the archive room seemed to shift, temperature fluctuating subtly, shadows warping with each slow breath he took. He had been awake too long, immersed too deeply. He knew that. Yet knowing didn't change the sensation creeping through him. Something was wrong. Not with the evidence. With him. He spread the Polaroids again, comparing handwriting, decoding patterns, searching for the thread that connected Mara's rose motif to the initials on the back of the photo. His eyes kept drifting to the WR. His initials. Backwards but undeniably close. Coincidence? It had to be. And yet, he felt a memory stir, faint, unreliable, like trying to recall the melody of a song once heard in childhood. He closed his eyes. A cold October morning. Church steps dusted with frost. Mara kneeling to speak to him, her braids slipping over her shoulder. "Here," she whispered, pressing something into his small palm. A small metal object. A charm. A token. The memory blurred, shifted. He blinked, and the image scattered like dust. He looked again at the pendant lying in its evidence bag. No. Impossible. He had never held it. He had only admired it from afar. Hadn't he? A cold sweat collected at the base of his neck. He flipped the Polaroid over again, staring hard at the initials. The faintness of the pencil made it hard to tell whether the letter was actually a W or an M. The angle was odd. The line curved strangely. M-E, or W-R-M-E, or something else entirely. The symbols rearranged themselves every time he looked. He checked the notebook, pages of roses drawn again and again. One rose, drawn darker, had initials beneath it. R.H. Rowan Hale. He sat back, breath caught in his throat. No. He would have remembered. He would have known if she had written to him. Wouldn't he? His pulse hammered against his ribs, the sound echoing in his skull like muffled footsteps. He grabbed the notebook and turned more pages. Another rose. Another small scribble. Not initials. Not words. A date. 10/7. He whispered it aloud. It means nothing, it's just a date. But it was. It was his birthday. He let the notebook fall onto the table. His memories of Mara had always been illuminated, the music at church, her smile, the pendant glinting at her throat. But now shadows crept into those recollections. What if he had spoken to her more than he remembered? What if he had followed her around the church piano? What if he had heard things he shouldn't have? What if she had confided in him, trusting the quiet boy who always lingered at the edges of rooms? What had he forgotten? Or repressed? Or reshaped? He pressed his palms to his face, fingers trembling. Sleep deprivation could cause this, patterns forming where none existed, emotional bias, projection. But beneath all rational explanation ran a deeper, quieter terror. What if his mind was protecting him from something? He forced himself to breathe, slow, controlled. Voices drifted from memory. Grace, sometimes the people most affected never talk about it. His mother, Rowan, don't wander by the woods. Hargrove, years ago, in a rare, unguarded moment. There are things a kid should never see. He tried to anchor himself in logic, in facts, in the chain of evidence. But the case files weren't clarifying anything. They were refracting it. Each piece of evidence pointed in multiple directions. Every symbol folded back onto itself. Patterns were appearing that had no business appearing. His perception, his memory, his certainty, all were blurring. The lamp on the table flickered, casting long, wavering shapes across the scattered photographs. Mara's face seemed to shift in the shadow dance, her eyes darkening with something unreadable. Suddenly, Rowan couldn't tell if he was remembering her as she was, or as he feared she had been, or as he wanted her to be, or as guilt painted her in hindsight. The truth was no longer a single path. It was a hall of mirrors. He stood abruptly, needing air, needing space from the evidence, from the circling thoughts that no longer felt like his own. His reflection in the dusty window pane startled him. He looked older, hollowed, a version of himself shaped by the case instead of the other way around. The twist wasn't in the evidence. It wasn't in the suspect list. It wasn't in her final moments. It was in him. He was no longer investigating Mara's disappearance. He was investigating his own fractured memory, his own role, real or imagined, in the story he thought he knew. And the most terrifying possibility whispered through him like a cold wind. He might not trust himself anymore. 7. Ending feels haunting and unresolved. Truth brings no peace. Morning crept in slowly, though Rowan didn't see the sunrise, only the faint gray press of daylight seeping under the archive room door. He had not slept, had barely moved. The evidence lay before him like an autopsy of memory. Yet nothing was clearer. Everything was heavier. The meeting with the DA came and went in a haze, questions asked, answers given automatically. DNA evidence linked a local man, long deceased, to fibers found near the Ellison property. A tidy conclusion for the public. A headline already written. Case closed. Community relieved. Justice served. But Rowan felt none of it. Grace found him afterward, standing in the hallway outside the briefing room, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on something far away. "It's done," she said quietly. He didn't answer. "Rowan, you can breathe now." He looked at her finally and she saw it. The fracture, the uncertainty, the truth that closure had offered him no relief, only more questions. "We solved it," she insisted gently. "You solved it." "No," he whispered. "I just filled in the blank they wanted filled." She stepped closer. "What are you afraid of?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, because the answer was too fragile to say aloud. "I'm afraid the story I've told myself all my life is wrong. I'm afraid," she wrote to me, I'm afraid I forgot. I'm afraid what I remember isn't real. I'm afraid I mattered to her in a way I don't understand. I'm afraid the guilt isn't imagined. I'm afraid the case is what shaped me. I'm afraid I shaped the case. Grace waited, but no answer came. Instead, he turned and walked away. Later, alone at his apartment, he placed the photocopy of the Polaroid on his kitchen table. The initials on the back looked different in daylight, clearer, or perhaps just crueler. WRME. Or ME, or nothing at all. He traced the letters with a fingertip. The case was officially solved. The town would rest easier now. But Mara's face in the photo still felt like an unfinished sentence. And the weight behind his ribs, the one he'd carried since childhood, hadn't lifted. It had deepened. He folded the photocopy, placed it in a drawer, and shut it with a soft finality. Night fell again. Softly, quietly, the kind of quiet that presses on the skin. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, those same woods he'd once feared without knowing why. The sound carried through the window like a whisper of something forgotten. Or something waiting. Rowan turned off the light and sat in the darkness. The shape of the winter rose pendant lingering in his memory. The case was solved. But peace was nowhere in sight. Some stories don't end. They echo. They haunt. They remain.